You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hello, and thank you for joining the American Revolution. This week, episode 360, the Judiciary Act of 1789. Last week, we covered the establishment of the executive branch with the appointments of secretaries of war, state, and treasury, as well as an attorney general. This week, we take a look at the establishment of the federal court system. The first bill introduced in the new U.S. Senate was the Judiciary Act. The Constitution had given relatively little details on what the court system should look like. One reason for the vagueness was that the convention delegates did not seem to agree and figured it would be better to leave that debate up to the legislature. Well, now it was the legislature that had to fill in those details. The Judiciary Act became Senate Bill No. 1 and was introduced on April 7, 1789, the second day that the Senate had finally gotten its quorum to begin business. The first day had been taken up with confirming the Electoral College vote for George Washington and electing its officers, including Senator John Langdon of New Hampshire, who became the first president pro tempore of the Senate. It was important to get the courts up and running, but drafting the details of the bill would take time. The Senate referred the bill to committee for consideration. It included one member from each state. Now, there were only 8 states represented in the Senate at the time, so the initial committee had only 8 members, including Oliver Ellsworth of Connecticut, William Patterson of New Jersey, William McClay of Pennsylvania, Caleb Strong of Massachusetts, and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. A week later, senators from Maryland and South Carolina finally showed up, and they were also added to the committee. Now remember, the Senate only consisted of 20 senators at the time, and only 11 or 12 of them were actually showing up at the time for sessions. Many states had only one senator present, so the committee consisted of almost all the active senators who had arrived in New York by this time. I mentioned the names of the key players on the committee, but typically the most credit for the bill goes to Oliver Ellsworth. He's been involved in a number of things in our story so far, and I really haven't focused on him before, so a little background. Ellsworth came from a relatively good Connecticut family. He started college at Yale, but ended up transferring to the College of New Jersey at Princeton. There he became good friends with William Patterson and Luther Martin. Ellsworth became a successful attorney before the Revolutionary War. He also served in the Connecticut militia, where he rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel before the war began. Ellsworth was a patriot from the beginning, and as a militia officer, led cavalry against the British in New York in 1776. Military life, though, was not really his thing. Ellsworth maintained his legal practice during the war and ended up serving in the Continental Congress beginning in 1777. After the war, Ellsworth became a state judge in Connecticut. He also received an appointment to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and there he got to work alongside his old college buddies, Patterson of New Jersey and Martin of Maryland, to help draft the Constitution. I mentioned when we talked about the convention that some delegates were more active and some barely showed up at all. Ellsworth was one of the more active delegates at the convention, and he even served on the Committee of Detail, which played a big role in the final version of the Constitution. Ellsworth, though, left the Constitution a few weeks before it ended, so he never signed it. Still, he was a strong supporter and also played a big role in Connecticut's ratification convention. He emerged as a leading Federalist and was very supportive of the Washington administration. After being appointed one of Connecticut's first senators, Ellsworth took on a role which was essentially that of a majority leader of the Senate, even though that position did not officially exist at the time. On the Senate committee that had been designated to write the Judiciary Bill, Ellsworth became the bill's main author. Writing a bill that would be acceptable to everyone was not easy. The outline of the judicial branch, as I said, had been particularly vague when it was written during the convention. The delegates did this because they really didn't agree on what the judicial branch should look like, and the senators also did not agree on what the judicial branch should look like. Many states had used their ratifying conventions to put restrictions on the new sort of federal court system that this committee was tasked with creating. Republican senators on the committee, men like Richard Henry Lee and William McClay, were sent to the Senate with instructions to limit the power of the new federal court system. Other Federalist senators, like Ellsworth and his old college buddy William Patterson, advocated for a more powerful federal court system that could handle a wide range of issues. Speaking for the opposition, Lee of Virginia reminded the committee of the complaints outlined in the Constitution that Americans considered it illegitimate to be tried in courts that were some distance from their houses and without a jury. These issues had been listed in the Declaration of Independence as reasons for breaking with Britain. And remember, there was no Bill of Rights attached to the Constitution yet, so many senators were concerned that the Judiciary Bill be sure to respect these basic rights. Another big issue was debts to Britain. Part of the peace treaty had promised good faith in allowing British creditors to collect pre-war debts owed by Americans. Many states had pretty much ignored this promise and were not making it easy for British creditors to pursue debt collection against Americans. Many anti-federalists opposed a new federal court system that would make things easier for these British creditors. Among the changes the Virginia ratifying convention had demanded was limiting federal courts to maritime issues and the Supreme Court to cases involving foreign diplomats and disputes between state governments. Federalists, men like Ellsworth and Patterson, disagreed. They wanted a robust federal court system that could hear a wide variety of cases. At a minimum, this included any questions that involved federal laws or treaties. They wanted to create a whole system of trial courts in all the states that could hear a wide variety of issues. The committee worked to form a consensus among the disparate views represented by those on the committee. After about 3 weeks, we're talking about the end of April, the committee had drafted their guiding principles for the bill. They agreed to establish both a Supreme Court as well as 2 levels of lower federal courts. The Supreme Court would consist of 6 judges that would convene for relatively short terms twice each year. They also agreed to establish district courts, 1 in each state. In between the district courts and the Supreme Court would be circuit courts. These would hear appeals from the district courts, and the reason they were called circuit courts was because the country was divided into 3 circuits. One circuit would consist of New York and New England, another would be South Carolina and Georgia, and the final one would be the middle states, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and Virginia. Rather than appoint a whole new set of judges to sit on these circuit courts, the committee would have 2 Supreme Court justices that would serve in each circuit, with justices sitting on a court panel with a single district court judge to form a 3-judge panel to hear appeals from the district court. So the Supreme Court justices literally rode circuit to go to these various courts. The circuit court was meant to meet for a relatively short period, twice each year, allowing the justices to do the double duty with these 2 short court sessions at the circuit court level and then the 2 short court sessions at the Supreme Court level. The committee agreed to some things that would limit the scope of federal courts. One which had been suggested by several state ratifying conventions was to put a minimum dollar amount on civil cases that could be heard in federal court. One reason was to prevent people from being forced to travel a great distance to contest relatively small cases. Most states would have only 1 federal district court, meaning a person might have to travel more than 100 miles to contest a case in a federal court. The committee tentatively agreed that a case had to be worth $300 or more. At the time, $300 was a fair amount of money, probably as much as a common laborer would earn in an entire year. This limit ensured that the majority of cases, which usually involves smaller amounts, would remain exclusively in state courts. One area of general agreement was that federal courts would hear maritime issues, that is, cases that involve ships on the high seas. In the colonial era, these tended to be held by British admiralty courts and were not really a traditional area of jurisdiction for state courts. Members also agreed to limit the Supreme Court appellate jurisdiction from state courts to issues that involve federal law. State interpretations of state law would be final and unreviewable. With these general guidelines in place by early May, the committee was ready to start writing the bill. The records on this process are pretty sparse. There doesn't seem to be much official record of the subcommittee that drafted the bill, but we do know that Ellsworth, Patterson, and Strong were the ones who really worked together to draft this bill. All three of them were strong Federalists who wanted a pretty robust federal court system, but the men were also mindful of putting some limits to keep the anti-Federalists from getting too upset. It took the subcommittee about a month to come up with a completed bill. They submitted it to the full Senate. At the time, all Senate proceedings were secret. Unlike the House, there was no way for the public to watch the Senate, and its records were not published publicly. The committee submitted the proposed bill to the full Senate on June 12th. Under the new Senate rules, the 16-page bill would be printed and distributed to the senators for review. It would also be read, literally read out loud to the Senate in full several times. After the first reading, senators could propose amendments. Jurisdiction was a big issue. The committee recommended that the courts have jurisdiction over any questions of federal law. On the first day of debate, Lee, who voted against this bill in committee, moved to restrict the district courts to just maritime and admiralty issues only. Other issues involving federal law could be argued first in state courts, and then only at that point could they be appealed to federal circuit courts. The Senate majority, however, rejected this amendment. They also put in limits on federal appellate courts so that they could not retry the facts that had already been determined by lower courts. They could only focus on the way laws applied to those facts. The point of this was that jury trials, which were held at the trial court level, would have the final say over the facts of the case. A part of the issues involving the judiciary got mixed in with the debate over the proposed Bill of Rights. I'll address the Bill of Rights in an upcoming episode, but since those amendments covered a fair amount of the restrictions on the courts, the senators allowed those amendments to put some safeguards on federal courts rather than trying to put all of those safeguards into the judiciary bill. The final bill created 13 district courts, one in each of the 11 states that had joined the Union so far, plus one in Maine, which was still part of Massachusetts, and another one in Kentucky, which was still part of Virginia. It also created the 3 appellate circuit courts and the 6 justices on the Supreme Court. The final bill was passed by the Senate by a vote of 14-6, and with that the bill moved to the House of Representatives on July 20th. Now the House at the time was busy debating the Bill of Rights. It put off the debate on the judiciary bill until the end of August. James Madison had been a key leader in getting the Bill of Rights through the House, and everybody kind of looked to him to lead the fight over the judiciary bill. Instead, Madison took a more laid-back approach. He really didn't make any fundamental attacks on the bill. The House ended up proposing about 50 changes, but these were all pretty minor changes, and they generally accepted the structure of the courts as outlined by the Senate. Madison seemed to convey his attitude during a closing speech on the debate. He essentially said that, okay, the bill was imperfect, but that it was late in the session and they had to get something done. Since this was a statute, unlike the constitutional amendments that they had just been considering, any problems with the judiciary bill could be fixed through statutory changes down the road. As a result, the House passed the bill 37-16. A joint committee made a few more minor changes, but Congress passed the final bill on September 21st, and it was signed by the President 3 days later. By the end of September, Congress had ended its session, and the members went home. Before they could leave, though, the Senate had to confirm some federal judges. As I said, the President signed the bill on September 24th, and the senators wanted to shut down and be out of town that week. Washington, fortunately, had been following the judiciary bill and had all of his appointments ready to go as soon as the bill was passed. Only a few months into his term, Washington had already given up on the constitutional requirement that he seek the advice and consent of the Senate. In early August, the Senate had rejected one of Washington's appointments to a position as tax collector at the port of Savannah. Washington walked into the Senate and asked for the reasons why his appointment was rejected. The president's sudden appearance, without invitation, was met with shocked silence. Eventually, one of the senators who had opposed the appointment told Washington that the Senate owed the president no explanation of their motives, and they simply sent the president packing. A few weeks later, Washington returned to the Senate to seek its advice on a potential treaty with some Indian tribes. Washington expected that he could discuss the proposed treaty with the senators and get their advice and consent right then and there. He came armed with a copy of the proposed treaty and was prepared to answer any questions, along with his Secretary of War, Henry Knox. Instead, the senators seemed to argue with each other for hours over matters of procedure. Many of them said they couldn't hear the reading of the treaty. Eventually, the Senate voted to refer the treaty to committee for deliberation and not give the president any answer. Washington, who, as I said, had expected an answer right then, showed one of his rare flashes of temper as he stormed out of the Senate. After that, Washington gave up on seeking the advice of the Senate. He simply submitted his written proposals to them for their consent. So when he signed the Judiciary Bill into law, Washington had not made any formal attempts to seek the advice of the Senate about his appointments. He did not even have an Attorney General at this point to give him advice, since the Judiciary Act created the office of Attorney General. Instead, Washington relied on informal discussions with Madison and to a lesser extent Hamilton. Some senators expressed annoyance on the point that the president was seeking advice from non-senators and not seeking advice of senators as the Constitution required. Now, Washington may have made some informal inquiries to some individual senators, but he didn't try to seek the advice of the Senate as a body. Washington had learned his lesson with the rejection of his port collector that he needed to consult individually with legislators from the state where he was making appointments. These were the people who were most likely to reject a nominee, often on local political reasons. By conferring with senators and congressmen from the appointee's home state, Washington realized he could avoid many future rejections. Now, we don't have much recorded about these informal discussions about the nominees. We do know that Washington was concerned that the Supreme Court have some geographic diversity. There were only 6 justices, so not every state could be included on the court, but there was no more than one appointment from each state, and all the larger states were the ones represented. Washington considered a few different people for Chief Justice. These included James Wilson of Pennsylvania and John Rutledge of South Carolina. In the end, though, Washington wanted a leader who was known more nationally. He selected John Jay of New York. Jay, of course, was well known for his work on the peace treaty that ended the war. He was also a highly respected jurist. Wilson and Rutledge both received nominations as associate justices, as did John Blair of Virginia, William Cushing of Massachusetts, and Robert Harrison of Maryland. Washington made these nominations on the very same day that he signed the Judiciary Act into law, September 24, 1789. Despite whatever bother senators felt about their lack of input into these nominations, they wanted to get out of town and were not going to let this hold them up. They confirmed all of the nominees 2 days later, with no hearings and little debate. It appears that Washington did not even confer with all of the nominees beforehand. Harrison, after being informed of his confirmation by the Senate, wrote back to refuse the appointment as an associate justice. On the same day that Washington appointed the Supreme Court justices, in fact, on the same piece of paper that he sent over the justices' appointments to the Senate, he also appointed 13 district judges, 13 U.S. attorneys, and 13 marshals, one for each of the new federal districts. Again, without debate, the Senate confirmed all of them 2 days later. Now, with no good record as to why Washington chose his nominees, we cannot say for certain how he made his choices. Presumably, he did consult with politicians from each of the states, as well as his trusted aides, men like Madison. Lots of people were lobbying for government jobs at the time, and Washington did have a strict rule of not discussing nominations with anyone unless he initiated the conversation. Decades later, Madison would comment on Washington's process for choosing nominees. He said, "Although not idolizing public opinion, no man could be more attentive to the means of ascertaining it. In comparing the candidates for office, he was particularly inquisitive as to their standing with the public and the opinion entertained of them by men of public weight. On important questions to be decided by them, he spared no pains to gain information from all quarters, freely asking from all whom he held in esteem and who were intimate with him. A free communication of their sentiments receiving with great attention the different arguments and opinions offered to him, and making up his own judgment with all the leisure that was permitted. A week after the Senate confirmation, Washington recorded in his diary that he had sent out all the commissions. His work on the creation of the federal courts was complete. Next week, Congress gets down to working on the Bill of Rights. Hey, thanks for joining the American Revolution Podcast After Show, part of the Airwave Media Network. Thanks to my Patreon supporters in the Alexander Hamilton Club, George Davis, Mike Hager, John Celentano, Michael Mulhern, and Mitchell Anderson. Thanks also to Robert Morris Circle supporters, Richard McCabe, and 10 Crucial Days. I also want to welcome Joe Spencer, Don Lippman, and David Becker for joining Patreon at the standard bearer level. I really do rely on Patreon support to keep this podcast going. As way of a thank you, everyone who can support me at the $10 level or higher will receive a magnet with a different flag from the Revolutionary War each month. And if that's a little too steep for you, remember that just contributing as little as $2 per month really does help, and it also gets you access to commercial-free episodes of all my current and back episodes. I also want to thank William Kohani, Bo Bryce, and Matthew Gass for one-time gifts via PayPal or Venmo. I really do appreciate both the financial support and your kind words of encouragement. Before we get into our discussion of this week's episode, I need to make a correction, or at least a clarification, about the last episode. In episode 359, I mentioned the creation and appointments of the first cabinet positions. I discussed the War Department first, then Treasury, then State. It should be noted that Congress created the State Department first, not the War Department. And this is actually relevant today because the presidential line of succession, after Vice President and the leaders of the House and Senate, goes to the cabinet members in order of the seniority of their department. Today, the State Department is senior to the Defense Department, which still holds the seniority of the Department of War after it changed names after World War II. As a result, the Secretary of State is the first cabinet member in the line of succession. The reason I discussed the departments in the order that I did was that the appointment of the first Secretary of State came much later after the appointments for War and Treasury. So even though the Secretary of State was the first cabinet position created, it was the last cabinet position to be filled. So, on to this week's episode, covering the adoption of the Judiciary Act. As I noted in the main episode, the constitutional provisions for creating a judiciary were extremely vague, and this was because there was little precedent for a federal judiciary and no one could agree on what it should look like. As a result, the Judiciary Act passed in 1789 became the template for the federal judicial system and one that has maintained its general structure. So any concerns that Adams had saying, oh, we can just change it later, really didn't come to be. Once the president was put in place, it was very hard to change. I mentioned in the main episode that one appointee to the Supreme Court turned down the position. Robert Harrison had been an aide to General Washington during the war. He left military service in 1781 to take care of his family after his mother and father died. At that point, he got appointed to the General Court for the state of Maryland and later became that state's Chief Justice. Harrison rejected the federal position, citing reasons of health and family. His brother had died recently, and he had assumed care of his brother's children. Several people reported back to Washington that Harrison had actually been pretty torn on the decision and only rejected it quickly because he didn't want to spend too much time before giving a definitive answer to the president. Washington encouraged Harrison to reconsider and asked him to come up to New York for more discussion. So in January of 1790, Harrison began to ride up to New York, but he got sick and returned home, where he died a few months later. This vacancy did give Washington an opportunity to appoint a justice from North Carolina a few months after that state finally did ratify the Constitution. The number of justices on the Supreme Court has tended to fluctuate. The reasons for changing the size of the court was when the number of judicial circuits in the country grew. They had to have a justice for each circuit. There was, however, some politics that always played a part in these changes. In 1801, after Jefferson was elected, the outgoing Federalist Congress reduced the court to 5 in order to prevent Jefferson from getting to nominate the next justice. Of course, the incoming Congress simply repealed that law and put the number back to 6. And in fact, they went even further in 1807, when Jefferson was still president. Congress increased the size of the court to 7. In 1837, Congress increased the size to 9. A part of this increase was to ensure that a majority of the court would be friendly to slavery. During the Civil War, Congress added a 10th seat in order to add an extra anti-slavery justice. But when the position went unfilled before Lincoln was killed and Andrew Johnson became president, Congress quickly reduced the size down to 7 so that Johnson would not be able to make any appointments. Congress changed the number back to 9 after Grant became president. When the size changed, a justice could not be removed, but if one died or resigned, the president would not get to appoint a new one until they got down to the new number. The court has remained at 9 ever since the Grant administration. However, during the 1930s, there was an effort to pack the court. Franklin Roosevelt did not get to make any appointments to the Supreme Court in his first term of office. He got frustrated that the court was striking down most of his New Deal. Roosevelt proposed a new law that each justice over the age of 70 would allow an extra justice to be appointed. Given the rather elderly court at the time, this would have given FDR the opportunity to make 6 appointments to the court for a total of 15 justices. Now, this ended up being a rare political misstep for Roosevelt, as the country thought the court-packing scheme was a politicization of the courts. The proposal failed to pass Congress, and Democrats lost 78 seats in the next midterm elections. Despite this loss, they did still keep a majority in both houses. Roosevelt was eventually able to appoint 8 justices to the court, but that did not break George Washington's record. He appointed a total of 10 men to the Supreme Court. My book recommendation this week is called Rewriting the History of the Judiciary Act of 1789, Exposing Myths, Challenging Premises, and Using New Evidence by Wilfred Ritz. This book looks at the history of how and why the act was written the way it was. The author, who was a law professor, was attempting to correct some of the errors in earlier books, some of which were written by Supreme Court justices. This book may be getting a bit into the weeds for non-lawyers, but I have found it to be an interesting look at the process that created the Judiciary Act. It was first published in 1990. I have listed a few other books on my blog that tackle this same subject, but if you want just one book on the topic, consider Rewriting the History of the Judiciary Act by Wilfred Ritz. My online recommendation is a book called Sketches of Debate in the First Senate of the United States by William Maclay. Now, if you recognize the name of that author, William Maclay, then congratulations, you've been paying attention. In the main episode, I told you that Maclay was the senator from Pennsylvania, and he sat on the committee that created the Judiciary Bill. Maclay was an anti-federalist who was highly critical not only of the Judiciary Bill, but of many actions by the Federalists in the first Congress. The official records of the early House and Senate, for lack of a better word, suck. They leave out all sorts of details and give no information about most of the debate. Also, remember that the Senate was not open to the public, so there aren't even any journalist accounts from this time period either. Senator Maclay took great notes on these debates during his service for the first 2 years of Congress. Just as James Madison's notes were the best source we had for the Constitutional Convention, Maclay's notes are the best source we have for the first 2 years of Congress. His journal wasn't published until the late 1800s, but it has been a key source for historians ever since. As always, I've included direct links to the 1880 version of his journal that I've published on my blog and website. My question this week asks, why, after the Revolutionary War, did they not change the name of New England? Well, in world history, many revolutions try to change everything about the old system and begin completely anew. The American Revolution was not one of these types of revolutions. Most colonists had been generally happy with British rule until the 1760s. Their main point of protest was that they did not like some of the changes that Parliament made at that time, and they simply wanted things to go back to the way they were. When the colonists finally decided to declare independence and break with Britain, they still didn't really feel a strong desire to break the cultural and historical ties with Britain. They simply wanted more control over their powers of taxation and regulation. Only a few names of towns and counties were changed during or after the war, mostly those that were named after individuals who ended up actively fighting against independence. Places with names of former monarchs or places within Britain generally did not change. The term New England first originated from the 17th century effort to put all the colonies in that region into a single colony. Now, that effort failed pretty quickly, but the name stuck. Everyone just used it as an unofficial reference to refer to the group of colonies that were to the east of New York. After the Revolution, people saw no need to change that, so New England remained New England. If you have a question you'd like me to answer, please reach out to me either via email or on X, Facebook, Quora, or Reddit. Well, that's all for this week. I hope you will join me again next week for another American Revolution podcast.